Dealing with conflict from Harvard Business Review, there are 4 main types of conflict. Number 1, relationship. 2, task. 3, process. And 4, status. Relationship conflict is a personal disagreement. For example, someone interrupts and talks over you in meetings. Task conflict is a disagreement over the goal. This is the most common source of disagreement. In other words, you don't know what the objective is. Process is a disagreement over the process of achieving that goal. For example, what is the best tactic to reach our quarterly target? How quickly should we finish a project? Status is a disagreement over your standing in the group. For example, who's in charge or who deserves credit. Now, there are 4 ways to deal with conflict. Number 1 is do nothing, which is sometimes the best approach, believe it or not. 2 is indirectly address the conflict. For example, go through a boss or some sort of third party. This approach is more common in East Asia. And now we have the direct address. This is a solution that tends to be dominant in places like the United States. This is where you have a conversation, you talk about the problem directly, and it is the main focus of this book. And 4 is exit the relationship, and this is basically a last resort. Now, there are 2 personality types or tendencies among people. The first is avoiders, people who hide from disagreements. They really value harmony. The second are seekers, and they're eager to engage in conflict, and they really value honesty. Avoid the extremes. You don't want to fight with everyone, and you also don't want to give everyone what they want. Identify your goal. Move your stalled project forward, for example. You want to preserve the relationship, or you just want to move on and forget about the situation. How to get ready for difficult conversations. Number 1, check your mindset. Are you feeling angry? Are you feeling nervous? Are you calm? 2, see the situation from the perspective of the other person. This is something that I've learned just generally in life, that if you're feeling angry or you feel like someone took advantage of you, if you just go through the imaginative exercise of seeing it from their perspective, it'll help diminish the anger, diminish the disappointment, and also makes you better prepared to engage in the conversation. Consider the larger organizational context. So a lot of times when we have negative emotions, it's really, we're thinking very narrowly, we have tunnel vision, but if we see the bigger picture, it helps us have better perspective and control our emotions better. 4, plan your message. 5, prepare for multiple scenarios because you don't know how it's going to go. Pick the right time, choose the right place, and consider venting before you get into the conversation. Focus on where you agree with the person. Manage your emotions and their emotions. Listen to your colleague's perspective, but also make your perspective heard, and create an organized list of issues to resolve. So this is similar to the way you want to go into negotiations. You don't want to just try to win or try to get more. You want to have a clearly thought out series of objectives or things that need to be addressed or things that you want to walk away with. How to handle conflict. Take a solution-focused approach, not a diagnostic one. The goal here is to come to a solution. It's not necessarily to figure out what went wrong or why we keep clashing, things like that. It's not about figuring it out. It's more about moving forward. And you're going to be much happier with yourself if you're focused on the solutions and the outcomes. Diving right in to straighten things out is not the only way to address problems, and sometimes it's not the best way to do it, even though I personally have a bias towards that. I have a bias towards being eager to engage in conflict, addressing the conflict directly, and just diving right in to discuss it and get to the root of the issue. Okay, so how to handle conflict. Do nothing. This is good if you don't have energy, if the other person is unwilling to have a constructive conversation, or you have very little power. There's no point in arguing with somebody. Indirect approaches to conflict would be circling around an issue rather than naming it and addressing it. Appeal to someone else who can speak to your colleague instead of you. You can also use a story or a metaphor. So this is particularly effective if somebody's very sensitive, I would say. If you can tell a story rather than sort of implying that they did something wrong, they'll get the message without it seeming like you're telling them what to do. So for example, talk about an employee you previously managed who struggled to listen. The moral of the story is that listening is a value, but tough to learn skill. Respecting the other person to understand the problem and do something about it without telling them what to do. So this is a very sophisticated approach to interpersonal relationships. And it's a strategy that is done very much in Asia that I think is an underdeveloped skill, especially in the US business environment. But I would consider having this in your toolkit for approaching conflicts. Someone from a direct culture may not respect what he perceives as a passive approach. Do this when your culture demands being indirect or when someone is more likely to take feedback from someone else. So, for example, going through a colleague that they respect or is friends with. And I just want to say that for me personally, this is my instinctive reaction, is that when someone's being indirect and implying things that is the wrong approach, that you should come to me more straightforward, more directly. But now I have a much more sophisticated understanding that sometimes this is the appropriate way to handle things. And it's important to understand your biases so that when somebody takes an approach that is not your default, like being more direct or indirect, it doesn't mean that they're wrong. It just means that this is a different style of dealing with a situation. All right, now we have the direct approach where you both come to an agreement on a resolution. The problem with this approach is it might heighten the conflict rather than diffuse it. And you would tend to want to use this if you're worried about having lingering resentment. So some people who always give people what they ask for and say yes, 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 what they have is lingering resentment towards those people that keep asking them for things. So in situations like that, it's better to directly address the issue. You also use the approach when the other approaches don't work. So maybe the indirect approach didn't work or doing nothing didn't work either. All right, now the other thing here is just to exit the relationship. And one approach you can do is just build relationships with other people, other companies, other departments. Maybe you don't want to complain to HR about a boss, for example, because it's not the best thing for you politically. So the best thing is just to transfer. You do this if you can easily find a job elsewhere or when all the other options have failed. One thing to keep in mind is that we tend to think of this as conflict as dealing with personality clashes. So somebody that's an avoider of conflict or a seeker of conflict, for example. But more often than not, the real underlying cause of workplace strife is the situation rather than the people involved. What people think they're fighting about isn't actually what they're fighting about. So that happens a lot. That's why understanding what the goal is really one of the biggest things in resolving a conflict. Because if you can both agree on the goal, and often you do, then you're able to create a more constructive conversation to resolve the issue. Personality conflicts are often really process conflicts. Seekers lose patience when people aren't direct or honest. This type of person may be seen as difficult to work with. They're quick to snap, or sometimes they're even mean. One advice for those of you that are conflict seekers is to ask your counterparts to voice their opinion because they may not be speaking up. Avoiders, on the other hand, don't want to hurt other people's feelings. It's extremely important to them to have positive relationships with colleagues. They're generally seen as easy to get along with. And one thing that they could do is they could earn respect from others by being more direct than they are by default. Consider resolving conflicts in private meetings or via email. So I've worked in large companies, mid-sized companies, small companies, and often I hear conflicts out in the open where a boss chastises an employee right in front of everyone else. It's kind of embarrassing. You want that person to save face, so a private meeting's often best. Your conflict handling style, the Thomas Kilmann conflict mode instrument, TKI. Here are the 5 types: avoiding, accommodating, compromising, collaborating, competing. And I would say I lean towards more like these, but perhaps I need to expand my toolkit to include more of these. Maybe you lean towards these and you need to start considering other approaches. People who are volatile and confrontational tend to be that way in a lot of different situations. So you can ask colleagues for input. So for example, does Sam normally get upset like that? And then you can get a better perspective. It also helps you depersonalize the situation, because if someone is generally confrontational, then it's not really about you, it's about them. Show curiosity. People like to be asked about themselves. So, for example, you might say, correct me if I'm wrong, blah, blah, blah. Do I have this right? So, asking for clarity. What do you do in your culture when people disagree? Curiosity is a very good way of dealing with particularly anger or anxiety, is just understanding things better. It's common to set a goal to change a person, but often that goal is not good. So, for example, you want to show your colleague her passive aggressiveness doesn't work. These goals are best dropped before they lead to fights. It's difficult to change a person. It's much easier to just focus on what you want to get out of the situation. In other words, the goal. It's easy to get aggravated and lose sight of what you want to achieve. And again, conflict resolution is similar to negotiations in this sense. Don't lose sight of what you want at the end of the day. It's not about getting more. It's not about winning. It's about going into the meeting and coming out with what you plan to get out of the situation. Don't ever tell someone they need to calm down. Conflict seeker, asking questions to get to the root of what was behind the delays. So this is an example of what a conflict seeker likes to do. They like to ask a lot of questions to get to the root of the issue, but then the other person feels harassed, feels blamed, because they're not that type of person that would do that. And I ran into this situation before where I was a product marketing manager, a senior product marketing manager, and sales was complaining about the leads being down. So I just kept asking them questions to try to get clarity and understanding the lead situation. What are the issues with the leads? Where are the leads not coming in? I was running tests with the leads, but the way that the salespeople perceive me, because I'm a conflict seeker, is that I was accusing them of something. I was blaming them for the issue with the leads, but really what I was trying to do was help them. I was just trying to diagnose the problem so that I could fix it, so that I could advance them. I had no malicious intent at all, but that's how it can be perceived when you're this type of person, when you're more direct. So be careful. Constructive conversation. Difficult conversation goes best when you think about it as a normal conversation. So don't think of it as this huge, big deal that you need to get anxious over. Focus on what you stand to gain. The company that you're working in may value consensus, so keep that in mind. It's not necessarily democratic where you have debates and things, so be culturally sensitive there, especially if you're working internationally. So for example, I've traveled, companies I've worked for have had offices in India, in Japan, in London, and I was working in the United States. Well, I had to adjust my behavior based on that. I remember when I flew to Japan, you're expected to present yourself in a much more modest way, whereas in the United States, you're encouraged to be much more boisterous or enthusiastic or much more of an entertainer and become the center of attention. So I had to recalibrate myself significantly there. Most people know what they want to say, but are less aware of what the other person heard or understood. I think this is a very important point in life, is that people really only hear a percentage of what you say or what you read. So that means you often have to repeat yourself. You have to clarify. You have to encourage them to ask for clarity. Communication is a surprisingly difficult skill. Ask yourself, am I too emotional right now to deal with the issue? Don't try to solve differences via email. Email misses tone and nuance. Suppressing your emotions can lead to bad outcomes. Consider venting beforehand. So go to a friend, go to a colleague and vent, and that way you won't when you get into the meeting later. Come up with a list of questions. Again, curiosity and clarity are great. Manage your emotions, listen well, and be heard. Asking for advice makes you seem more warm, humble, and cooperative. I have a friend who is not a conflict seeker, and she's been pretty successful in her career. And one thing I've noticed is she won't debate with you. What she'll do is she'll ask questions. And asking questions helps her get clarity, but it also makes me kind of question, okay, well, maybe I am wrong. She's not telling me I'm wrong, but she's making me think about the situation more. I think it's a very clever way of addressing issues. Flattery is an underrated skill, and it works well up and down the hierarchy. Now, there's a Stanford professor who talks extensively about power, Jeffrey Pfeffer, and how flattery is one of the most powerful tools to gain power. And it works well with your employees as well as your superiors. All right, focus on the future, focus on your body, look around the room, say a mantra, take a break, take a deep breath, acknowledge and label your feelings, and allow for venting. So these are ways with dealing with difficult situations, especially if you're feeling anxious. Yelling back when you're being attacked doesn't help. Visualize words flying over your shoulder instead of hitting you. So somebody is criticizing you or attacking you. Well, just imagine you're not being personally affected by that. It's just flowing over your shoulders. Indicate that you're listening, even if they're being accusatory. Don't interrupt their venting. Listen instead of trying to figure out what you're going to say next. Don't take what someone else says at face value. They might just be angry. Maybe they just lost a big contract or something like that. Some questions to ask. What about this situation is most troubling to you? What's most important to you? What would you like to see happen? What does a resolution look like for you? Asking for clarity is incredibly important because we misunderstand situations all the time. There's so much miscommunication in the world that just understanding what it is that they actually want or what bothers them can make a world of a difference. Start sentences with I, not you. Admit blame when appropriate. Be creative. People like to focus on the past to understand it, but what you focus on grows. That means you should really focus more on the solution or the outcome. Consider buying a person a coffee. One way to build rapport is to ask questions. Involve other people. I have to admit, this is an approach I didn't use enough in my career. I would always, in most situations, I would try to deal with people directly, but often the best approach is to escalate to superiors. So for example, there was a time when I should have gotten my vice president to get involved in the situation, and he taught me that that's something I need to do. I need to learn when to offload the issue onto somebody that has more authority than I do, because I always felt like I needed to take command of the situation. Email increases the likelihood of conflict and miscommunication. People use less restraint in virtual environments, including email. Look for opportunities for informal interactions. So for example, one way I built rapport with my colleagues when I worked in a large company was I would invite one of the head of analytics and research out for lunch. Or perhaps I would meet with somebody casually to go get a coffee downstairs outside of the formal office environment. I had a project manager who invited me to go out, and he built rapport with me that way. And then I felt more inclined to do favors for him later in the future, like delivering a presentation on how projects were going. Share personal snippets or jokes in messaging apps helps build rapport outside of the formal context of work. Let's say you have a passive-aggressive counterpart and you're not sure, that person isn't sure how to address conflict directly. You can work around that person or distance yourself from them. Knowing what's behind the disagreement can help depersonalize it, so understanding why they feel upset and why they're being passive-aggressive, rather than focusing on you and why you're hurt by that. Let's do another example. Let's say your colleague goes over your head. And keep in mind that in some cultures, this is normal. It's not considered a bad thing. I had this before. I had an employee under me who went over my head when I was away traveling on vacation. And maybe she just felt that was a normal thing to do, but it ended up backfiring for her. Another key thing is to problem solve together. Research shows people are more attached to ideas that they had a hand in shaping. So for example, one thing I did when I would come up with big marketing plans is I had to get buy-in from a bunch of different people, from product managers, from specialists in the marketing team, from video production. So one way that I helped get buy-in was showing them the preliminary plan early so they can give input, and then they feel more ownership of the final plan because they had a say in it rather than simply revealing it to them at the end. So this is something that as you get more advanced in management, is you learn that it's better not to surprise people. It's better to tell them early so they feel ownership, that they're bought into the resolution. Ask the question, how do you hope this will be resolved? Imagining is the opposite of defending, and using your imagination can help you get out of a rut. This is something that a Buddhist monk that I stayed with has advised me on, is a lot of the time need to use our intuition or imagination to solve issues because there's no clear-cut kind of objective solution. If we could get the right people, for example, what could the campaign look like? That gets you in a creative mindset. You want to come off as wise, thoughtful, and in control. Often getting in between people that are having a conflict is a bad idea, especially if you're being used as a pawn in their conflict. Often it's best to do nothing. You aren't a psychologist or a mediator. So for example, you might say, you seem hurt, but I can't take sides because I have to work with both of you, and then you're able to sidestep the issue. Your relationship with your boss is a significant predictor of your experience at work. People act out when their ego is threatened and their competence is questioned. So I had a boss once who was very insecure. He was a new boss. And there were times where his ego was threatened and his competence was questioned. And that's when I started to see his strange behavior. And looking back, that makes perfect sense. Stroking their ego can be very effective, especially if their ego feels threatened. Flattery, again, a very effective tool. Call out bad behavior when it happens, often immediately. Radical candor is a popular approach that's trending these days. Only time I've seen bullies change is when they are publicly fired. So there are people in the workplace that are fundamentally bullies, and you may not be able to change them, but this is one thing that might actually change their behavior. Determine if you've contributed to the problem. So in this case, think of yourself as a manager. Maybe you were unclear about the roles that you assign to people. Maybe you fostered unhealthy competition between your underlings. One solution would be to focus the employees on work. So for example, put employees on projects that require deep collaboration. Maybe you've been too hands off. So this is something I've learned in the workplace, is that I don't like to be micromanaged. So I just defaulted to nobody wants to be micromanaged. But I realize there are a lot of people who just have very specialized skills and they need to be micromanaged, especially when it's anything that is outside that very narrow specialty. So I've had to adjust my management style based on what the role is. I've also learned that when you're managing someone in design, for example, they're going to operate on a very different cadence and in a very different way than somebody that's in, say, product marketing. Top performing teams immediately and respectfully confront one another when problems arise. Demonstrate that you value the relationship. Sometimes it's very easy to just address the conflict and talk about the conflict, but you also need to consider the human side, which is, hey, I value you as a person. I value how much you've helped me. I just have this one issue that I wish we could overcome. You can ask your colleague to go for coffee outside the office. That helps build the human relationship there. The change of scenery can also help reset things, especially if they're very tense. Consider that there are linear thinkers and non-linear thinkers. So people that think sequentially, step by step, other people that are more, let's throw everything in and sort of creatively, organically come to a solution. And not everyone's going to process things the same way as you. Don't assume everyone will speak up if they have ideas. So I worked in an office where there were about 2 or 3 people who generally dominated the conversations and were always the ones shooting out ideas. But there were other people that were more thoughtful, maybe more introverted, who may have had superior ideas, but they just didn't speak up. Or they wanted to take everything in before they came up with a recommendation. So encouraging people to speak, I think, is a great idea. Try to see the situation from the other person's perspective. I'm repeating that over and over again. It's just incredibly important for your sake and theirs. Conflict itself may not be the problem. How we handle it is really that matters. It's not that there is problems, that there are conflicts. That's inevitable. But it's how you manage and deal with that. Having a process to deal with conflict is incredibly important. So for example, someone may be frequently talking over you and interrupting, but that person may not see it as rude as you do. So the process there is just perhaps explaining how it makes you feel when that happens. Many of us prefer to stifle our feelings and move on rather than speak up. Conflict that's not expressed can be worse than conflict that is. Team members may be too absorbed by their differences. So look for win-win situations and common interests and care for others. Have a genuine concern for the well-being of people, even when they're people you're having intense conflict with. Process conflict can improve results by drawing on the expertise of the whole group. In stable social hierarchies, lower status individuals defer to those with higher status, and higher status individuals look out for the welfare of lower status ones. And I want you to keep that in mind, especially as you climb the corporate hierarchy or as your business grows, that you're going to have a responsibility to take care of those people that are beneath you and those people that have lower status. Don't just see them as pawns in your corporate game.